process whereby monarchy is carried on from one generation to another is often more complicated and, as it were, indirect than the simple notion of, as it were, son succeeding father would lead one to suppose.
That was David Cannadine talking about the complicated history of Britain's kings and queens.
He managed to convince the British people, who were fairly dubious about the monarchy after the horrors of the abdication, that this was an institution which mattered, which was important in their lives.
And that was Philip Ziegler on the importance of George VI's reign to the British monarchy. You're listening to the History Extra podcast from BBC History magazine. We're the UK's best-selling history magazine, available from all good newsagents or via subscription. Check out our latest subscription deals at historyextra.com/subscribe. The magazine is also now available on many digital devices, including the iPad, iPhone, Kindle, Kindle Fire, Google Play, Kobo and Zinio. Look out for us in your App Store or newsstand, or find out more at historyextra.com/digital. Welcome to our fourth podcast of January 2015. I'm Rob Attar, the editor of BBC History magazine. The Penguin Monarchs series is a new collection of concise biographies of England's kings and queens, written by some of the country's best-known historians. To launch the series, the publishers Penguin held a debate in London featuring several of these authors, and our reviews editor Matt Elton was lucky enough to go along to watch it. This special edition of the History Extra podcast features that debate, as well as a series of interviews Matt recorded with some of the participants. He first spoke to David Cannadine, the author of George V, The Unexpected King.
So why do you think this series of books is important?
Well, I think it's a very original idea on the part of the publishers, though to say that is itself perhaps debatable, since what's new about publishing the lives of every English and then British monarch in a series? Well, the answer is nobody has ever done that before in modern times. So either this is a very good idea because nobody's done it but there'll be a big market for it, or it's not a very good idea, which is why nobody has done it before. I, of course, as one of the contributors to this series, have a vested interest in believing that it's an important series, that it will reach a broad audience, and that it will do many things, ranging from providing, in some senses, a history of the whole of this country as it's changed over time, from being England to England and Wales, to being the United Kingdom, to being the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, to being the British Empire, and seeing how the monarchs have been central to that process of development and have changed over time. And I think that that will come out if anybody's willing to read all of these books from cover to cover in sequence. But even if they're not prepared to do that, I think that the series does serve as a reminder that for much of this nation's history, monarchs have been absolutely central to it as rulers. And while monarchs these days reign but don't rule, I don't think we need reminding that if we think of the life of the present Queen, that even monarchs in the 20th century and perhaps the 19th century who have reigned but not ruled have themselves been hugely important. So it is my own view and my own hope that this will turn out to be a very important and very significant series about a subject that we all perhaps feel we can take for granted, but I think what this series will show is that that isn't so.
Talking about themes that emerge from more than one book, to what extent do you think monarchs were aided by the fact they didn't expect to come to the throne, and was that the case with George V?
One of the things that's going to be enormously interesting and fun about this series is reading monarchs' lives against each other, and often across the centuries in ways that one otherwise wouldn't expect to do or wouldn't be able to do. And if we take the volumes that are just coming out at the moment, one of the things that does emerge, if we take Henry VIII, if we take Charles I, if we take my man George V, and if we take George VI, none of those monarchs, and we're therefore talking along across several centuries, none of those monarchs was born to be king. And yet in the end they all became king. So it is a reminder that the process whereby monarchy is carried on from one generation to another is often more complicated and, as it were, indirect than the simple notion of, as it were, son succeeding father would lead one to suppose. And if we take the last 200 years, Queen Victoria, King George V, King George VI and the present Queen were all born not with the expectation that they would become king or queen. So it's a very pronounced theme, certainly in the history of modern monarchy, but also in earlier times. If we think of the Tudor period, Edward VI was the only Tudor monarch who was born expecting to become sovereign. So it's an important theme, certainly across the centuries, that so far the 5 books that have just appeared provide us with a way into.
And it seems to have been a positive thing in their lives. Why do you think that was?
Well, it certainly does seem to be true that quite often monarchs who were not born expecting to be monarchs did rather well, whereas on occasions monarchs who are born expecting to be monarchs don't do so well. And one of the reasons they may not do so well is because it often means they're waiting around for a very long time. If we think of George IV or Edward VII would be obvious examples of that, of monarchs who have to wait around a very long time before they finally, in what we would now call old age, get the job that, as it were, their whole life has been a preparation for. And of course, it will not escape you that that might perhaps have some implications for current and future circumstances.
Talking again about George V, to what extent did he set the tone for the monarchs of the rest of the 20th century?
I think George VI was a hugely influential monarch in all sorts of ways, and one of the ways in which he was particularly influential was that he settled for this style of public grandeur, a certain form of private probity and decency, a liking for country life, a certain quiet form of Anglican observance, and a belief that the purpose of monarchy was to try to transcend the social and class divisions of the country. And I think that monarchy, that style of monarchy, that mode of monarchy, was one in many ways that George V perfected. It was very different from the raffish, cosmopolitan, louche style of his own father, for example, and very different, of course, from the raffish, rather loose style of his eldest son, Edward VIII. But if we take George V, George VI, and the present Queen, there's a significant continuity, I think, around those values and modes that George V, at least in retrospect, pioneered and was able, in some senses, to institutionalise through his second son and then through his granddaughter.
And finally, what sense of a man do we get? What would he be like if we met him face to face?
I think one of the ways in which George V is very interesting, and he's actually interesting in lots of ways, is that he was terribly good as being the father of his people. He wasn't very good at being the father of his own children. I think that he performed and helped redefine the public roles of monarchy exceptionally well. He was, for example, a very accomplished broadcaster with a rather beautiful speaking voice. But I don't think he was socially somebody who one would find memorable or easy sitting next to at dinner. So although I think he performed many of the jobs of monarch very well and helped to redefine them and extend them, I think the job of being socially adept and being a warm-hearted father were things that he was rather less good at.
That was David Cannadine. Matt then spoke to Stephen Alford, whose book, subtitled The Last Boy King, explores the life of Edward VI.
So you write that Edward's always been a bit of a mystery.
Yes.
What did you make of his personality?
Still difficult, still elusive in all kinds of ways. It's very hard, it was very hard, and I think still is very hard to make sense of personality, character, temperament of a child without the context of adulthood. And there's some sense of sort of being unfinished and being incomplete in all kinds of ways. I think the essential, really the first essential starting point with Edward is that he was the only one of the Tudor monarchs who was ever expected from birth to be a king. And that expectation was always there. That weight was always there, and I think Edward was hugely conscious of it from a very, very young age. from really almost as soon as he was writing letters to Henry VIII, to Catherine Parr, when he was seven or eight. And there are different messages, I think. There are messages about the love of learning and of virtue. Virtue is a word that keeps popping up in Edward's works over and over again, letters over and over again. Virtue over magnificence, learning and education. So there's that sort of element of the experience for Edward. But increasingly as he got older, I think a stronger, kingly voice of authority. Still a little bit of fantasy to it, by the time he's 14, 15, and yet a strong sense of self, of rule, and of the need and expectation to rule, and a certain kind of bossiness as well. And that comes through very strongly in letters and exchanges with his noble companions at court. Dukes and earls and barons of his age, or maybe a little bit older. And one friend in particular, Barnaby Fitzpatrick. And there are some fantastic letters from Edward to Barnaby when Barnaby was in Paris on a diplomatic embassy, getting some experience of the world of the court, the French court, and some hugely bossy letters, really, from Edward to Barnaby, emphasising what he should and shouldn't be doing, and a sense of a young boy who knew he was in charge, really.
That's the thing about him. It's amazing that he was only ever a child. What do you think his legacy was?
The legacy is a really sort of complicated one. The immediate legacy was political crisis. A boy who, at the age of 14, 15, was quite as conscious as his father of his powers and authorities in determining the succession, of writing two half-sisters out of the succession, and of trying to engineer the accession of his cousin Lady Jane Grey in 1553. So the immediate legacy was one of political emergency in the summer of 53. Beyond that, the legacy of Edward was very much a legacy of what his subjects understood him to be. And there's an element of Protestant hero about it. This is a period of scouring change and reformation, of sweeping away of so many of the elements of Catholic England. And Edward, so far as we can tell, seems to have been fully subscribed to that. So huge changes with big implications over many decades. And also, I think another long-term political legacy was raising bars of expectation, or raising the bar of expectation for what his sister, half-sister Elizabeth, would do, who really resented, I think, and resisted any comparisons with her brother, or any expectations that she would follow a similar pattern of thoroughgoing Protestant reform. So in a sense, there's a very high bar set for sort of kingly reformation and change that Mary tried to reverse as much as she could, and Elizabeth found a deeply uncomfortable legacy.
And finally, if you could travel back in time somehow and ask Edward a question, what would you ask him?
I think the big question, the big mystery still about Edward is 1553, his device that altered the succession. It exists, it's in the king's hand, we know that he wrote it, we can sense that he conceived it, he pushed it. It was very much his project, but we know so little about the context. And I think the question or questions I'd want to ask would be about where the idea came from. How did he write it? What were the circumstances? Was it something that he produced on his own? Was he pushed? Was he encouraged by political interests and big figures at court around him? So I think that's really the big mystery.
That was Stephen Alford. Matt also caught up with Philip Ziegler, whose book The Dutiful King focuses on the life of George VI.
To what extent did he shape Britain's experiences during the war?
Obviously, the most eminent, the most widely known, the most popular figure in Britain in the Second World War was Winston Churchill. Therefore, to some extent, George VI was always slightly in the shade. But he nevertheless, when I say he used the war in a master way, I mean, the war gave him the opportunity to resonate in the public mind in a way which had never happened before the war. This vision of the king picking his way through ruined buildings after the Blitz, patently, desperately concerned about them, worried about his people, interested in them, involved in them. I think it gave an impression which was less potent than that of Churchill, but in a curious way more emotionally involving. People really grew to love the idea of the monarch in these really stressful years when everything seemed to be going wrong. Chaos was around the corner. And there this was, this sort of still, slightly grey figure, absolutely not in any way deviating from his conviction that we were going to win the war and that he was going to be there when it happened.
And despite not being that keen on becoming king, what legacy do you think he left our current queen?
He took over a throne which was tottering. And it was not tottering to the extent he thought it was, but he believed that after the abdication crisis, the monarchy had been gravely damaged, perhaps fatally damaged. He handed on to his daughter the most stable throne in the world. He must have done something right. And I think he managed to convince the British people, who were fairly dubious about the monarchy after the horrors of the abdication, that this was an institution which mattered, which was important in their lives, and which the country needed and supported.
That was Philip Ziegler talking to Matt Elton. And now let's hear the debate, which featured David, Stephen and Philip, together with John Guy, author of Henry VIII, The Quest for Fame. The chair of the event was the historian Helen Castor.
John Guy is one of the great names in Tudor history. A fellow of Clare College, Cambridge, he's previously written lives of Thomas and Margaret More, Thomas Becket in an excursion into the medieval world, and a prize-winning biography of Mary, Queen of Scots. For Penguin, he's turning his attention to the big man himself, Henry VIII. Stephen Alford is Professor of Early Modern British History at the University of Leeds. A former student of John's, he's now joined him as one of the leading lights of 16th century history. He's written with great distinction, most recently on the secret world of Elizabethan espionage, and the monarch he's giving us is Henry VIII's son, Edward VI. With Professor Sir David Cannadine, we leave behind the 16th century for the modern world. David is Dodge Professor of History at Princeton and has written extensively on the history of 19th and 20th century Britain, the British Empire and the United States. Yet another string recently added to his bow is the editorship of the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography. And the life he's written for Penguin is that of George V. And the 20th century is also where we find Philip Ziegler, a remarkable man of letters. On top of 2 distinguished careers as a diplomat and a publisher, Philip has written more than 20 works of history and biography on subjects all the way from the Black Death to Edward Heath. And his monarch is George V's son, George VI. Now we're going to start by talking a little bit about each monarch in turn before widening the discussion to a broader perspective. And I thought we should take them in chronological order. So, John, we need to start with you and with Henry. You've spent many years writing about Tudor England, and the men and women around this most famous of our kings. So is this life of Henry VIII a distillation of all that experience, or is it the reaching for you of a new perspective?
No, because I wanted to completely re-engineer the way that I thought about Henry to write this book. And of course, writing a book as short as this on a reign so big is actually in itself quite a challenge. So I decided, as indeed Mark Kishlansky decided in his book on Charles I, and I have to say that is a wonderful book. The fact that he's not here because he's in Boston, Massachusetts, doesn't mean you shouldn't buy his book. It's a fantastic book. But that's the commercial over. No, I wanted to re-engineer Henry from scratch because in the last 12 years I've primarily become a biographer. And that means seeing things from the point of view of your subject and also considering their inner world as well as their exterior world. So I really wanted to do two things in this book. I wanted to see the main events of the reign through Henry's eyes. I also wanted to understand how it was that a king who was so politically secure felt so insecure psychologically. Remember, this is a king who will spend 2 weeks sort of thinking out how to execute, wives or ministers or, whatever, or great nobles, but won't turn up for the execution and, wants to do something different at that moment. But he's also a king who, there are moments when he loves his wives, or the wife of the moment, and there are moments when he loves his children, even though he sent Thomas Cromwell with instructions when his elder daughter, Mary, would not accept the royal supremacy, sent Thomas Cromwell to tell her that if she didn't conform and sign, the articles, her head would be beaten against a wall until it was like a baked apple. Nonetheless, this is also a king. He can be a monster. He can be a much more constructive, intellectual, art-loving sort of person, the sort of person that, one would quite sometimes like to know, although personally I wouldn't want to go to the pub with Henry VIII. But, of course, he's also a king who loved his dogs. He adored his dogs. Cut and ball, he would pay, actually, in modern money, £500 a pop, if they strayed away. He loved his coursing spaniels and he loved his greyhounds, and he would spend up to £1,000 on a jewel collar for one of his mastiffs, and spend an astronomical amount on dog food. He even had clocks made in the shape of dogs. So he's a really eclectic. This is an eclectic man. This is a man who will go out with Thomas More onto the roof of a royal palace while Thomas More is his secretary. That's actually, you must always remember that. Thomas More was the secretary before he ever became Lord Chancellor. The secretary was there 24/7. He knew Henry better than probably anybody else. This is also a man whom Henry, at the drop of a hat, will send to the gallows, or rather to the executioner's block. And Henry is a man who he has a conscience which is infinitely flexible, and what he decides to be expedient, he also decides to be just. He can also turn against friends and ministers at a moment's notice. But actually, the sort of thing that we're here today to do is to actually not talk about our monarchs ad infinitum, but actually to put them into a 500-year or even a 1,000-year context. And in that context, it seems to me that what really matters about Henry, this is a man who's big in shape, big in ambition, both for himself, the monarchy, for the institutions of the country. He had an insatiable thirst for fame. He wanted to be like Alexander the Great, even from when he was 9 years old.
And this is the title you've given to your book, that Henry VIII, The Quest for Fame.
Yes, but I'm going to let the audience into a secret. that originally in this series, because these are the first books to be published, and the series work, there's a trajectory you learn as you go along. And originally there were to be no subtitles. And then quite late in the day, after the books were in, there were to be subtitles. Well, actually, for me, that was quite easy, because I realized when this was called upon that my book was actually The Quest for Fame, and there was no need to alter a word. It already was that.
So Henry VIII was himself seeing himself in that long context, in the context of the generations to come. If you're saying this is a quest for fame, this is about lasting achievement and lasting
memory. Oh, of course,
memory.
yes. Well, he'd had a very brief visit as a young boy, at 1499. He's still 8. And Erasmus of Rotterdam, the most famous intellectual in Europe, comes with Thomas More. And he meets Henry, and he's immediately struck by the fact that this is a boy who wants to do. I mean, his elder brother Arthur is still alive, but this is still a young boy, who knows how to steal the show at other people's parties. And this is through. This is one of the big themes of the book. But look, Henry also had, what we might call the Cassius Clay syndrome. I mean, he wanted to be the greatest. I mean, the thing about Henry is he uses art. And he uses printed propaganda to be his own, PR person to get the message across. And Hans Holbein the Younger. Go on the tube. What is iconic of the British monarchy today? Even, historic royal palaces, their most commonly reproduced image, Henry VIII by Hans Holbein the Younger. And Holbein would have had a wonderful career working for Charles Archer, in the good old days.
And you mentioned Erasmus meeting Henry when his older brother Arthur was still alive, and I think that's a very interesting element to this. Actually, 3 of the 4 monarchs we're talking about today, including Henry VIII, were younger sons. If that quest for greatness was there before he became the heir to the throne, does that secondary place affect Henry VIII's psychological and political development?
Well, actually, it does in a slightly different way to the one that you might be suggesting. It affects it because he was the second son. You do understand that in the 16th century, only the heir got a proper education, the top quality education, the Italian Renaissance type education. The younger son, Elizabeth I, was allowed to read the best classical texts only when she was in the succession. When she was out of the succession, she was back on noddy books. You understand this. And so, for a surprise, if you were the heir to the throne at age 6, you were given a top tutor from one of the, the best colleges in Oxford or Cambridge or whatever. Whereas Henry was brought up by women until quite a late stage, and unusually because royal women were never normally allowed to have control of their children. I mean, this was a big issue of content. Anne Boleyn went mad when she wasn't allowed to have Elizabeth close to her. Henry was with his mother, and his mother spoiled him rotten. And some of the characteristics of Henry's, petulance and Henry's, desire. I mean, his insatiable greed, essentially, his desire to accumulate things. The best chapter in my book, I think, is the one which is called The Second Solomon, where Henry sets out to be like an Old Testament patriarch, because he's made himself head of the church, remember, like Solomon in the Old Testament, sitting on an ivory throne. And literally, he sits on no such palace. He sits on an ivory throne in a sculpture on the wall, literally on an ivory throne, with Edward beside him, as in the Old Testament. And of course, he builds no such palace as a spectacular Renaissance extravaganza, and he goes there only twice. He spends the equivalent of, in modern money, about 100 million quid on a palace to which he only goes to twice. The reason was that no one looked for the water supply before they started building. So Elizabeth later could go there because they found the water supply.
So spoilt, but without the intellectual training.
Oh no, he had, but then he got the intellectual training. When after Arthur died, he got the intellectual training. And you see, your problem with Henry is that he is actually rather well educated. He's really rather intelligent, but it's a case of what Alexander Pope said. Little learning is a dangerous thing. Of course, the big disaster for everybody else, apart from Henry, was that because he did his own research for his first divorce campaign, and sent for people who sort of helped him to work things out. He was actually an expert on it, and then of course he got Thomas More to attack Luther, and Thomas More then he tried to involve Thomas More in the divorce. So they all knew too much, and of course this meant that issues of principle actually basically separated out, and you get these violent conflicts.
Well, one king who did have the rigorous training of the heir to the throne, because he was heir to the throne from the moment he was born, was Stephen, your monarch, Edward VI. And you've called your book about him, Henry VIII's longed-for heir, who inherited the crown at the age of 9. You've called him the last boy king, a phrase with all sorts of resonances. Could you tell us what's significant about that idea for you, the last boy king?
I think in a sense he could also be called the unfinished king, a king who was prepared from such a young age to carry the weight, to bear the weight and burden of the of the crown, of long expectation, and really a sense for Edward, by the age of 7 or 8, in writing letters to Queen Catherine Parr, to his father Henry, of understanding that heavy expectation, and perhaps over time seeing the potential of that, but also the at times you feel the pain of that also. The thing that I found really challenging still, I mean, beyond the book, about Edward, is trying to make sense of a child's life without the context of adulthood. And that's really difficult. It's much more difficult than I'd imagined, actually.
And part of that challenge must be working out the relationship between the individual, the private person,
Yes.
and the public figure, because government is being carried out in his name
Yes.
by all the adults around him. And yet, as he gets older, this fine mind with this great training and this burden of responsibility must be increasingly present. And yet the public and the private is a very difficult thing to sort out, isn't it?
It is, absolutely. And of course the relationship changed over a number of years. It was a royal minority. Royal minorities were problematic and had been problematic politically for a long, long time. Great risks, great dangers, but always shifting, never in a stasis. I mean, always moving. And the sense of Edward growing slowly and gradually into a role. But sorting out, in a sense, the public and the private is quite difficult. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. In a way, government, in a very real sense, government was carried out in the king's name, as it had to be, by a protector, by a governor, by the king's council. The private Edward, well, in a sense, that was one of the challenges of the book, to try and find the boy, to try and find the voice, to hear the voice. And we do have sources. We have wonderful sources. You know, we have lots and lots of words, thousands of words by this very young prince, very young king. But they're difficult words in all kinds of ways. And we have to kind of tune in our ears to work out the many layers of meaning and significance to get close to his, as John said earlier, kind of interior world, you know, which is, in a sense, what we're really interested in, I think, in the series.
And one of the illustrations in your very beautiful book is a very resonant picture from the Ladybird Histories, an illustration of 2 burly noblemen arguing with each other, and this little boy in the corner of the frame looking solemnly and slightly nervously on. Is that a fair representation of Edward's experience, do you think? Or was he a more active, more powerful figure than we might assume?
Oh, it's a tricky one. Well, with the reproduction of the Ladybird Book of Kings and Queens, I always push the intellectual heights. But I couldn't resist it. I really remember as a child, as a boy, looking at this image of a boy and trying to kind of make sense of that. I mean, yeah, in a way, in those early years, that there is a sense of sort of disconnection of seeing this very small boy trying to make sense, failing to make sense of a really complex political world with enormous challenges and enormous dangers. I think maybe that changed over time. There's an element of fantasy, though, to it. By the time he was 14, there's a developing kind of kingly voice and kingly register. There's a tone of command. There's an imperiousness. There's a bossiness. There's certainly a bossiness with his friends. There's a hint of finger wagging at councillors. He's not on the cusp of adult kingship. He's a good few years away from that. And yet, for all the fantasy, there's a sense of a king who was beginning to realise that he had to be in charge, I think.
And you've spoken of it as an unfinished life. Is it possible to say what how different the history of England might have been had he
counterfactuals.
lived. I know.
Oh dear.
Which of course started your wonderful book on Elizabethan espionage, so I felt I could ask you this, a counterfactual.
I think, well, yes. I'll just say yes. Without Mary, without Elizabeth, for Elizabeth, that deep discomfort, I think, at being expected to be a reforming Edward, which was something that Elizabeth entirely didn't, absolutely didn't want. Scourging, scouring Protestant Reformation. Archbishop Cranmer still with a kind of project in hand in 1553. The potential of Edward as another Henry VIII. Who knows? Yeah, I think it would have been. It would have been different.
And just very quickly, how do you feel about the decision of the Penguin series to miss out Lady Jane Grey? Is that the right who could have succeeded Edward, who for 9 days was recognised or not as Queen of England?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, in Edward's mind, there was an element of legitimacy there. Jane Grey represented an opportunity for the continuity of monarchy of a certain kind, that Edward, I think, in 1553, close to his death, valued.
Because we should say Edward nominated Jane Grey as his successor.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, disinheriting his half-sister Mary, disinheriting his half-sister Elizabeth. Having said that, there's such a sense of purpose and force in the way that Mary claimed the throne in the summer of 1553 that, in a sense, Jane is that kind of footnote. It's difficult.
Edward may have seen her as
pains
queen,
me to say
but no one else, really. Or very few people. Well, Edward VI is our only monarch this evening who was, from the moment of his birth, heir to the throne, and of course he didn't live to rule as an adult. But now we come to another king who, like Henry VIII, was the second son of his parents. And David, you've called your Life of George V the unexpected king. Do you see that circumstance of not having been born as heir to the throne? Did that have a defining effect on George V's reign?
Well, I ought to say that the point at which I learned that the subtitle to my book was The Unexpected King was when the publishers sent the proofs. Whether this meant they hadn't expected me to write the book, I have to say I'm not entirely sure. But it's a very good title, and they clearly were very wise in making it up for the book rather than leaving me to do it. But the substantive point is a very interesting one. Of course, it's true in the case of John's Henry VIII that Henry was not born expecting to become king. He had an elder brother who then died, which meant Henry then became first in line. It's also true, of course, of Mark Kishlansky's Charles I, that the same was true, that he wasn't born to be king. It's true of my monarch, George V, and it's true of Philip's monarch, George VI. And it's an interesting comment on the strangeness and almost randomness of this process of perpetuating an institution across the generations, which ought to be very straightforward. Monarchy is a brass tacks affair. T.S. Eliot, birth, copulation, and death. That's all the facts when you get down to brass tacks, birth, copulation, and death. And there is a sense in which monarchy is about birth, copulation, and death. That's kind of how it works and how it happens. But death is a kind of random variable in this. Insofar as Henry VIII's elder brother died and Charles the first elder brother died, and in the case of my man George V, of course, his elder brother was the Duke of Clarence and Avondale, a man of pitifully limited intellect, of even more limited attention span, a man whose morals were deplorable, and it was all to the good of the British monarchy that he died. There cannot be any doubt of that. He would have been a dreadful king, whereas George V was actually a hugely successful king. But for the first 26 years of his life, George V, as he became, did not expect to become king. And he went on to be a hugely successful king, and many, certainly in modern times, of this country's most successful monarchs, Queen Victoria, George V, George VI, the present Queen, were not born expecting that they would reign. So one of the slightly quixotic conclusions that one might draw from this, and I can't suppose this would necessarily play all that well at Highgrove House, is that the best preparation to be a monarch is not to be born expecting to be a monarch.
And is that because you then get exposed to experience that you wouldn't be allowed to have were you the heir to the throne? I mean, for example, George V's military naval experience before he became the heir to the throne, that he was allowed, am I right in saying, that he was allowed more active service, as it were, rather like Prince Harry today?
Well, George V and his elder brother both went on various naval expeditions together and, as it were, trained to go into the Navy, as indeed did Edward VIII as he became and George VI as he became in the next generation. I think another issue which this raises, as we are thinking, as it were, across monarchies and across centuries, is the difference between the notion of the fact that in the time when monarchs ruled as well as reigned, it was expected that they should be well educated, because they needed to be part of the broader culture of their time, in particular the Renaissance culture, which is, in a sense, the world that John and Stephen talk about. Whereas by the time one reaches the world of Edward VII and George V and Edward VIII and George VI, we move to a wholly different notion of a kind of Philistine monarchy. These were very undereducated people by comparison with their predecessors, but it kind of didn't matter. And maybe, actually, if you're going to be a monarch who reigns rather than rules, maybe it's a positive advantage not to be very well educated. I mean, that sounds slightly perverse, and again, it may not play very well at Highgrove, but there is a kind of case for that.
And how then did George, with his preparation or lack of preparation of various kinds, how did he see his role? Because Henry VIII, Edward VI, in waiting at least, were in a position where they were in charge of their world. They were directing, at least to some degree, the tumultuous events by which they were surrounded. But George V absolutely did not make the decision to go to war in 1914. He wasn't in control in the same way. How did he understand his role as king?
I think that's right. I think monarchs that reign rather than rule are reactive rather than proactive. I think that's certainly true. It's also the case, actually, that Edward VII did let George V, when heir to the throne, see state papers, which is more than Queen Victoria, Edward VII's mother, had ever let him do. So although he wasn't very well educated, he didn't come to the throne wholly unprepared. I think George V's notion of monarchy, to some degree, did conform to the adumbration of Walter Bagehot, the 19th century editor of The Economist, who of course wrote this famous book, The English Constitution, in which he said that there were two different parts of the English Constitution, the dignified part and the efficient part. And the efficient part allegedly was the Cabinet and the House of Commons, and the dignified part was the monarchy and the House of Lords. And Bagehot said that a monarch had three rights: to warn, to encourage, and to be consulted. And this is often trotted out as the essence of how to be a constitutional monarch, made up in fact by a 19th century journalist, and that's the founding text of constitutional monarchy, which itself is perhaps slightly interesting. And George V was certainly brought up on Bagehot. What he made of it, I'm not sure, since actually Bagehot's writing is very confused. George V, I think, was himself a conservative figure, with a small c and probably with a large C. But he did, I think, have an understanding that his job as monarch was not to intrude his own private views into the conduct of public business. And I think he saw the role of monarch, insofar as it related to politics, as being a kind of referee to try to bring people together, to see that fair play was observed, to bring people together over the row over the Parliament Act, over Ulster, and then over the formation of the national government. He rather liked coalitions. He didn't really like political parties. And I think he had a very strong sense that that was his job with regard to British politics. I think his job was also to set a certain tone to public life and to present himself as the father of his imperial people, at which he was very good, whereas as far as being the father of his own children was concerned, he wasn't anything like as good.
Which brings us, of course, to Philip's king, George VI, also a second son, but one who took the throne in very different circumstances from either George V or Henry VIII. It wasn't a question of a sudden death, making him heir to the throne, but instead, perhaps with echoes of Henry VIII, a sudden crisis revolving around the king's marriage, his elder brother Edward VIII. So he, of all our monarchs today, had the least warning of what was about to happen to him. Is that part of the key to understanding him as king, would you say?
I think he was, as you say, he was a prime example of the king who was not born to be king. I think he differed from most of the others in that he did not want to be king. He desperately didn't want to be king. He was horrified when the possibility occurred and convinced that he was inadequate and would not be able to do it. And he rightly thought that his elder brother, Philip, the Duke of Windsor, was quicker, cleverer, funnier, more charming, better at public speaking. He wrongly thought that this mattered most, and that integrity, decency, infinite patience, tolerance were features which mattered less than the other ones. And as a result, he came to the throne not merely unwillingly, but with a conviction that he was not going to be able to do the job properly. I think he was saved by two factors. One, most particularly his wife, who had all the charm which he lacked himself, who was infinitely good at public relations, who threw herself wholeheartedly into the business of sustaining him and keeping him going. And he had a man of tremendous sense of duty. He would undoubtedly have gritted his teeth and gone on to the throne if he'd had to. But I think without the help of his wife, he would probably have broken down.
So for him, perhaps more than anyone else we're talking about this evening, the relationship between public and private, the role and the individual, was a very, very painful one. Do you think it's one he ever managed to reconcile? Or was that strain, that tension caused by having taken on a role he didn't feel equipped to fulfill personally, did that continue? Did that shape his kingship?
From the very start, he was under intense pressure. As I say, I think without the constant sustaining help of his wife, he would not have been able to stand up to it. I think probably by the time he'd been 3 or 4 years on the throne, he found he was actually quite enjoying it. And the thing that really saved him in a way was the war. I mean, obviously he had nothing to do with running the country during a war. He didn't make policy or anything out. And indeed, with Churchill around, he didn't even have to be a sort of preeminent figurehead. But he achieved enormous popularity during a war just because of that sense of duty, of the image we all have of him as this slightly sad-looking man picking his way around the ruins of bombed London, and quite obviously caring desperately for the plight of his people, and sympathizing with them and identifying with them. And I think he acquired the love of his people during that war, which he would not have got if this sort of dramatic circumstance had not occurred.
Do you think that issue is really at the heart of the questions raised by the modern monarchy? If the monarch is, in some senses, still central to the functioning of our constitution, yet has no agency, to it, cannot direct anything, has to be a passive figure. Are we asking the human being at the centre of that to do an impossible job, in a sense?
I think we're asking some human beings to do an impossible job. I don't think we were asking King George VI to do an impossible job. He was extraordinarily well suited for it, because he accepted the fact that he was a figurehead. He had absolutely no wish at all to interfere with making a policy. And he was himself an intensely conservative with a small c individual. And if he had a vote, he'd have been an intensely conservative with a large C individual. But he saw it as his duty, when the Labour government came into power in 1945, to get on terms with them, to work with them. And it was a very difficult pill indeed for him to swallow. He did so, but he knew it was his duty to do so. And always he was possessed by this sense of duty, which impelled him, drove him, and sent him to an early grave.
Are we saying then, perhaps a bit like politicians, that actually the monarch who doesn't want to be monarch is the one we now want to do the job as well as it can be done? I
think a monarch who very, very much did want to be monarch would be slightly suspicious.
Right. Well, that perhaps does bring us on to wider questions that we can discuss with all four of our speakers today. All the kings we're talking about here, like all the other 41 subjects of these books, and like Elizabeth II today, were crowned and anointed with holy oil in a ceremony full of mystery and sanctity. Now, that was at the heart of Henry VIII and Edward VI's understanding of their power. And the ceremony is still there, but has that sense of sanctity gone? David Cannadine, do you think that's gone?
Well, I don't think it had gone in the case of George VI. Of course, I defer to Philip over that, and certainly not in the case of his wife, and I don't think in the case of the present Queen, in as much as they regarded the coronation as a sacrament, and that they were declaring before God and the people that they would serve out their allotted span as monarch. So I think that the sense that this is a religiously hallowed enterprise was something that George VI and Queen Elizabeth felt, and was something that the present Queen felt. I don't think that translated in the way that, as it were in earlier times, it might have done, into the notion that because this is an enterprise hallowed by a sacrament, it means you rule by divine right. I think that bit, as it were, had disappeared, but I think the sense that a coronation is a sacrament, according to the rites of the Church of England, of which the monarch is supreme governor, was powerful. And one of the things I think that's probably still many years off that's going to be interesting is if Prince Charles, when he becomes king, wishes to be crowned not just defender of the faith, which is of course the Protestant faith in a Protestant service, but defender of all faiths. There's going to have to be some very nifty theological footwork to try to make that work.
At which the English monarchy has of course excelled since the 16th century. John, what's your perspective on this in terms of the powers that Henry VIII claimed?
Yes. Well, of course, it's already done it, because, of course, the Defender of the Faith title was granted by the Pope to Henry VIII for defending the Catholic faith against Martin Luther, so history can make these little
adjustments.
Little convolutions. No. I mean, this question is absolutely central, because Henry broke with Rome. He was the loyal son of the Pope, who then quarrelled with the Pope, and he'd started to quarrel with the Pope even before the whole business of Anne Boleyn came onto the horizon. So he broke with Rome. He creates the Church of England. He suppresses the abbeys. He centralizes the country, not just in terms of the secular polity, through a bureaucracy based on Whitehall. I mean, Henry literally created Whitehall. I mean, physically, in terms of the physical space, he built the palace, but also in terms of the idea of command and control over the country. The power of Parliament was hugely expanded, although Parliament had to be accountable to Henry. That's another big change. At some moment, the monarchy became accountable to Parliament, not on Henry's life. But in terms of kingship, Henry dramatically transforms the theory of kingship, because he actually believes that he is not only supreme head of the church, he is Christ's deputy on earth. And take it from me, He believed this. You can see in his own handwriting, just briefly to sort of sketch how this came into play. As part of the first divorce campaign, having failed to get a divorce at Rome, Henry turns to new counsellors. These are coming out of the Berlin stable. Cranmer, Thomas Cranmer, we've all heard of him, the future Archbishop. Some of you probably never heard of Edward Fox, who was Provost of King's College, Cambridge. They were the think tank. They produced the dossier. The dossier said that not simply, you don't go on the narrow principle of can I get a divorce, you go on the big principle of who has legitimate power over the church. And they produced this masterful dossier based on partly true history, partly pseudo-history, partly sort of fake or doctored sources. And of course they were doing it to make a better world. They were compromising their, if you like, ethics in order to create a better world. And they produced this dossier in which Henry should reclaim the regality lost by the sort of negligence of medieval kings who weren't watching while the popes were unlawfully expanding their powers, and that the King of England had always been the head of the church. And actually, if you go back to William the Conqueror's reign, actually that's not actually quite a silly argument. We won't go there now, but we could. But he then annotates this in 46 places, and then goes on to lay down the Articles of Faith. He believed that he could interpret the Bible, and everybody had to follow that interpretation. He had a big discussion with Cranmer to and fro. He believed that he could ordain, by virtue of his royal supremacy, this role he had as Christ. He thought he talked directly to God, trust me. You didn't talk to God through bishops. Bishops were pushed into the background a bit. Could Henry ordain bishops? Could he ordain priests? He actually fought this. He tried a heretic wearing white. Rather like Alexander the Great would put on, that's the fame theme again, would put on religious dress. Utterly astonishing. It's hugely dangerous, of course. I mean, Cromwell knew this was nonsense, but of course, how to stop him? Yeah. Now, the point is that this is completely new, because we've all heard of Charlemagne, we've all heard of divine right monarchy in the Middle Ages. By Edward IV's reign, the last sort of, if you like, proper, male adult Yorkist king, this theory is just dead. It's in the bin. Henry absolutely brings it back. Now, it was a bit more difficult for Elizabeth because, of course, she was a woman. And, of course, masculinity comes into all of this in a very big way, and gender. But at a moment, Charles I's problem is that he thinks he can be like Henry VIII. But, of course, by then things have changed. We all understand from textbooks and, from our own knowledge, or even, and I've looked into this because this is obviously a theme of great interest to me. In 1689, this, if you like, sacral element was stripped out of kingship in the revised coronation oath. And the repercussions of it look just absolutely huge, because if you have this role, you can, as it were, give the laws like Anglo-Saxon theocrats. And if you think that Parliament is accountable to you, then that is also safe. So when did this disappear? I once asked, I shouldn't tell you this, but I'm going to tell you this, so I shan't name names. I once asked a sitting Archbishop of Canterbury what the present Queen thought about this. But of course I didn't expect him to give me an answer, and I'm not entirely sure that he knew, but his impression was that there was this sense, as David has mentioned, there's this sense that there's a special calling through this sacrament. Of course this is hugely politically incorrect in a modern multicultural, multi-faith society. And so I'm going to ask a question now, but I'm going to leave other people to give the answer and shut up. Now that a pope can abdicate properly, because, up until now, no pope has really properly abdicated. Celestine V sort of stepped down, but Boniface VIII was standing behind him, with a sort of knife in his back or a hammer. Now that a pope can abdicate, should this convolution, which is, of course, it was papal monarchy that fed into, to secular monarchy in the Middle Ages. Does this actually square the circle?
This is a question for Philip, whose King George V came to the throne as a result of an abdication, the only abdication of its kind. What do you think, Philip? Do you think that now, as John says, we have an abdicated pope, we have an ex-pope? Does that mean that the nature of the sacramental authority, the sacramental role passed on to a British monarch at the moment of coronation, could that now be given over to the next generation without the kind of trauma that was precipitated in 1936?
First, I'd say I would doubt whether what happens in the Vatican is likely to change the habits of the British monarchy. I honestly don't think the parallel is a very good one. But my guess is that the possibility of abdication has not, well, clearly has occurred to the Queen, but it has been dismissed simply because she believes it to be a job for life. And nothing is going to shake that view. And I think it's highly unlikely that when her son eventually succeeds to the throne, he will have any different views. It is, you are brought up with the belief that you are crowned, it is a sacrament, and you are stuck with it. And I don't believe there's any possibility, serious possibility, that we will see any further abdications. And the one abdication we did have, of course, was altogether freakish. And in a way demonstrated the fact that King Edward VIII shouldn't have been king anyway.
It's important, I think, to notice that in 1947, when she was 21, and in South Africa, the Queen made this famous broadcast where she pledged the whole of her life, be it long or short, to the service of the great imperial family, to which, in those days, the British monarch was the kind of top of the tree. There's also a bit of verbal slippage here, of course, about abdication. Edward VIII abdicated, that's to say he didn't want to be king. The previous Pope retired having done the job, and the presumption that abdication and retirement are somehow the same thing may be great fodder for tabloids, but they are rather different notions. I mean, I think few people would begrudge the Queen retiring. Almost everybody begrudged Edward VIII abdicating. There was a famous cartoon produced, was there not? In the Edward VIII broadcast, he said, "I have found it impossible to carry on doing this job without the health and strength and support of the woman I love." And there was a cartoon produced newspaper the next day of a navvy throwing down his shovel and saying, "I have found it impossible to carry on." Now that's abdication, reneging on responsibilities. Retirement is saying, "I've done the job for many decades, it's time for someone else." But I think the likelihood of a discussion which shows an awareness of those different words and what they describe isn't very high, and indeed isn't relevant because, as Philip says, she's not going to be giving up. You know, by the time the Queen dies, many of us will have been dead several years. So.
Stephen Alford, could I bring you in here? Given that this sacramental responsibility is passed down by blood,
Yes.
and in a sense we get the luck of the hereditary draw, therefore, is it possible to identify, as a historian, the qualities that have made a great monarch? And if so, are these positive qualities, or is there a case to be made for them actually being the lack of other qualities?
I'm going to evade your question beautifully and say that it depended very much on the period. And I think it does, to a degree, depend on that distinction that, in a sense, we've all been working around between rule and the expectation of rule, and control, and executive authority, and of being touched by the divine. And, yes, perhaps still an element of that, but a certain element of constitutional passivity, or at least it seems passive from the outside, looking on. Behind the scenes today, perhaps it's something very different in a Prime Minister's audience with the Queen. They're different things,
So
I think.
could we perhaps say that the qualities that Henry VIII and Edward VI would have thought of as the key elements to their kingship are almost the opposite of what we would now be looking for?
Yes,
We're talking about a mirror image.
Is it today passivity? Is it the willingness to be silent, to step back, to fulfill a symbolic role, to represent a sense of corporate national belonging and identity? Well, I think probably yes. For a Henry VIII, for an Edward VI, I think very different.
It is the issue of shifting from being, as it were, an efficient ruler to a dignified person who's reigning. I mean, monarchs historically are generically male, and that's because they're supposed to be warrior kings and philosopher kings and lawgivers. And that's historically what monarchs were supposed to do in a time when they ruled. Whereas constitutional monarchy is, in a sense, emasculated monarchy. They don't do any of those things anymore. And there's a sense in which it's feminized monarchy. It's much easier for a woman to be a constitutional monarch, I think, than for a man. Because if you're a man, you're still hankering after these macho things.
Doing things,
interfering. Whereas actually the point of being a constitutional monarch is that you don't interfere. And the Queen has done that very brilliantly, I think. I mean, we don't really know what the Queen thinks about anything. And to have sustained that across 60 years is a truly extraordinary achievement.
And culturally, we are used to the idea of figureheads being female, that figureheads on ships are female, statues of great conceptual qualities, justice or liberty, are female. So actually, Victoria works in a way, and Elizabeth II works in a way. Is Charles III, slip of the tongue there, Charles III, going to have a much more difficult time?
Well, I think part of the job of, if as it were, you have to give up for a variety of reasons to do with just historical evolution, the generically male aspects of monarchy, then part of the challenge of constitutional monarchy is finding other things for them to do. I mean, that really is a serious issue, I think, and philanthropy is very important. If one thinks of Frank Prohaska's works on the British monarchy as a philanthropic monarchy, the notion of a family on the throne, a family monarchy, is very important. I think going out and running or being a governor of parts of the empire was very important, though you can't do that now, because there's no empire left to govern. But this sense of finding alternative things for them to do which keep them occupied, keep them in the public eye, but keep them out of the business of government is, in a sense, the challenge of constitutional monarchy. And the Queen has been terribly good at that because she hasn't given us her opinions on almost anything, really, except which racehorses she prefers, and that's fine. I think what's going to be interesting some years down the line is whether Prince Charles really is, if and when he becomes king, going to insist on expressing as monarch the sort of opinions which the Queen never has.
John Guy, is our fascination with monarchs, which is an enduring one, I think, a useful way of organising our thoughts about our history? Or actually does it prevent us thinking in other, perhaps more creative, more unusual ways about the structure of our history?
Oh yes, well I think so. I mean, I'm not a historian of the monarchy. I just happen to know about certain, rulers. I mean, if the most everyone has their tastes, but monarchy to begin with is really a topic in the history of ideas. The modern monarchy, by the standards of the understanding of monarchy, isn't a monarchy at all, because it's castrated. It's a castrated monarchy, a feminized monarchy, if you like. I'm interested in. Essentially, I've become a biographer, which is, of course, very different to being a historian, because you're trying to look inside people's heads, which you can only really do in novels or films or whatever.
But still, therefore, we're looking at great men, usually men, not always, but the great, because those are the subjects historically that we stand a chance of looking inside the head of.
Yeah, I know, but actually we're also, particularly now, I've been in this game for, I won't tell you how long, but I was a student of Geoffrey Elton, so, some people will know, quite what that means. And what's transformed Tudor history is an understanding of, gender. I'm not a gender historian as such, but the difference between an understanding of the masculine and, the feminine elements in play, in kingship, queenship, queen consortship, in the case of Philip and Mary, that is, remember the man who sent the Armada against England in 1588 was the man who was married to Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's elder daughter, and Elizabeth's immediate predecessor.
So he was a king consort,
but you see, this is where the whole thing absolutely opens up, because Philip arrived. There were treaties. There's an Act of Parliament saying that Mary would be, solely and sole queen. That Philip wouldn't have a role, he couldn't interfere in politics. He had to be the equivalent of a consort, but he wouldn't come unless he had the title of king. The moment he gets here, of course, it all changes. It's like imagining that just issuing a piece of paper in Washington, D.C. is somehow going to affect what's happening in, remote Texas or, Arizona or whatever. It doesn't happen. And actually, you can see this visually. At the beginning of the reign, the crown is stuck over Mary. And by the middle of, it's a very short reign, of course. Philip arrives in 54. He's gone in, he's gone in 57. He doesn't even stay till 58. The crown moves, and by the end, it's over Philip and he's dealing with patronage, he's dealing with finance, he's dealing with defence. There's a very silly article that was written by, a series of silly counterfactual articles. What would the Spanish have done, if the Armada had, Geoffrey Parker wrote a brilliant one, but people who imagine, how would they have known where to go? Philip had controlled, ammunition and stocks and the defence at the Tower. So, I would, the gender issue. Elizabeth, I'm writing Elizabeth I at the moment. Do you think that Elizabeth I had authority because she was a queen? Certainly the first. Forget it. She was in a battle for 20 odd years to establish her authority against her own councillors because, people wrote books defending female monarchy at the beginning of her reign, saying the great thing about Elizabeth is that she'll be a queen who does what her councillors and judges tell her to do, which is a bit like telling Mrs. Thatcher that she's been made prime minister in order to be told what to do by her cabinet. So it's a whole different. That's the interesting area of this. If you want to be a historian of monarchy.
Finally, Philip. The hereditary monarchy that you have studied in looking at George VI's reign, is that no more than a historical curiosity now? And if so, does that mean its days are essentially numbered?
I think it's more than a historical curiosity, but it does not have any very great political significance. Psychologically, in terms of the inner life of the British people, the monarchy still, I think, plays a curiously important part. And national life would significantly be changed quite radically if a monarchy disappeared, even though the actual conduct of government would go on exactly the same way.
But one thing we know from the discussion this evening is that the British monarchy has never stood still, so we watch with great interest.
That was Helen Castor chairing a discussion recorded at the Emmanuel Centre in London last December. Books by all four of the speakers are now available in the Penguin Monarch series, published by Alan Lane. And you can read more from John Guy in an interview in the January issue of BBC History magazine, which is on sale now. Also in this month's issue, we explore the closing months of the Second World War from a military and domestic perspective. We find out about Charles II's sex obsession, and we get the inside story of Wolf Hall. You can get hold of our January issue for a few more days in all good newsagents and of course digitally. And if you'd like to take out a print subscription and you're in the UK, then you can currently take advantage of a special offer whereby you'll get your first 5 issues for just £1 each. Visit historyextra.com/subscribe to find out more about this deal, which ends on the 28th of January. And now it's time for the latest history news with our website editor, Emma McFarlane.
The accuracy of a new £2 coin that shows the signing of Magna Carta and King John holding a quill has been called into question by a historian who says the monarch would not have used such an instrument. Middle Ages expert Dr. Mark Morris told The Telegraph, "To depict King John holding a quill is simply a schoolboy error. Medieval kings did not authenticate documents by signing them, they did it by sealing them, or rather by getting one of their officials to do it for them. All the pen in John's hand symbolises is ignorance of this basic fact." The Royal Mint defended the coin, which was commissioned to celebrate the 800th anniversary of the Charter, saying the image was, quote, symbolic rather than, quote, factual. A spokesman said, "The design is symbolic of King John's acceptance of the Magna Carta. It is not intended to be interpreted as a literal account of what actually occurred." Magna Carta was endorsed by King John of England at Runnymede near Windsor on the 15th of June 1215. In other news, Wolf Hall author Hilary Mantel has insisted the characters featured in the BBC television adaptation of her books have clean, white teeth. In a bid to ensure the historical accuracy of the new 6-part series, which aired this week, Mantel said courtiers would have had white teeth, as sugar was not yet widely available. According to the Sunday Telegraph, she told cast members, "You do not have bad teeth and you are not dirty." The BBC Two adaptation of Wolf Hall stars Homeland's Damian Lewis as Henry VIII, Mark Rylance as Thomas Cromwell, and Claire Foy as Anne Boleyn. Meanwhile, an unmarked mass grave containing the bodies of more than 3,000 paupers has been discovered in Bristol. The disused burial ground was found at the 19th century Eastville Workhouse site by Bristol Radical History Group, which spotted the site on a 1902 Ordnance Survey map. The Eastville Workhouse, which was known as 100 Fishponds Road, had 1,200 inmates and was one of the largest of the 600 in England and Wales, BBC News reports. Bristol Radical History Group volunteers spent 2 years going through workhouse death registers at Bristol Record Office to confirm the burials.
Thank you, Emma. And just before we go, here's a reminder that we have 2 upcoming reader events taking place in March. On the 21st and the 22nd, we're holding 2-day events themed around Magna Carta and Waterloo. On each of these days, you'll get the chance to hear from a selection of expert speakers and enjoy a buffet lunch. For more details and tickets, please visit historyextra.com/events. And as always, BBC History Magazine subscribers will get discounted entry. Well, that's pretty much it for this week. Do join us next time when we will be talking about Elizabeth I with Lisa Hilton, while Anita Anand will be telling us about a remarkable suffragette with royal connections. Thanks for listening to this History Extra podcast, which was produced by Jack Fletcher. Do let us know what you think about this episode by emailing podcast@historyextra.com, and we might read out your messages in future episodes. Alternatively, why not keep in touch via Twitter or Facebook, where you'll find us at History Extra. For more great history content, don't forget to visit our website historyextra.com, where you will find history quizzes, galleries, articles and more. Plus, it's where you can download every single previous episode of this podcast.